prior to Whirlpool, I've been with the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, investigating antitrust investigations into be it precious metals or some of the Forex matters, as well as the SSA bonds and a few other things there. So Hera and I probably have been on some opposite sides on certain issues. I've also been.
I was going to say it'll be an interesting discussion.
It will be indeed. I have also had the opportunity and good fortune to work with the Sandbox team at the FCA when we first set it up in 2016, allowing disruptive tech to come to the marketplace at an accelerated pace. So I'm very close to technology such as blockchain and AI, and be it facial recognition softwares and robo advice and so on and so forth. I've then moved into FMCG and home appliances such as Ferrero and Whirlpool, where I currently am. So I'm hoping to bring a bit of a blend of the two worlds, so to speak.
Thank you, Ajinka. And we also have Patrick Varese, who's now with us, Deputy General Counsel at Huntsman Corporation. Patrick, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we'll kick off the session in earnest.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Good. Well, hello, everyone. Sorry for being a little bit late. So Patrick, Deputy General Counsel, Huntsman Corporation. What that means is I'm basically heading up the commercial legal team globally. And so I'm going to be the speaker today that's probably least knowledgeable about this topic, but I'll bring some other maybe viewpoints to the discussion. I'm a generalist, and so what I do is I protect or try to protect the risk of the corporation, and specifically some of the divisions I am responsible for generally, and of course trade compliance, third-party risk is certainly part of that. I've had a pretty typical career, started with law firms in Brussels, then joined Huntsman quite a while ago, 18 years ago. Started in Belgium, was then transferred to Shanghai and to Switzerland, which is where I'm currently still today.
Thank you, Patrick. Now, the topic of the day, and I'm glad to say we've set the three of you a challenge, is the very broad-ranging changing face of third-party risk management. And in particular, I think what the audience wants to hear about is how companies can and should revisit and upgrade their due diligence process to mitigate their compliance risks. And this is all in the context of compliance risks changing on a constant basis, and your former colleagues at Ajinka constantly looking for new areas to regulate and push people from best practice to regulatory obligation. It's a very broad topic. We're going to cover some geopolitical risks. We're going to cover some technology changes that are revolutionizing the way due diligence is conducted. I know there's an interest to talk a little bit about some specific technologies, such as the introduction of blockchain and what that could mean to third-party risk management. But we'll start broad. And Hera, if you want to start us off with what you think companies should have on their to-do list in the current environment, and maybe you can give us a financial sector perspective, and then Ajinka can follow up with a more sort of corporate, non-financial perspective.
Sure, no problem. But before I launch into that piece, I wanted to get to know our audience first a little bit, so we can tailor our discussion a bit more for them. So which is why we have a polling question prepared. It says, which jurisdictions do you work with on a regular basis? You can select multiple jurisdictions here. There's North America, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia, and others. So we'll give you guys a few seconds to key in your answers. I don't think we can vote.
No,
here.
no.
No, yeah. We're not allowed to compromise the integrity of the vote.
Already, yeah. I tried clicking on all of them.
All right, well, so let's wait for our attendees to kind of see what they're working with. So let us know. Oh, there you go. I can see the results on my screen, and it looks like majority work in Europe, which makes sense. We are, well, majority of us are here in Europe, and then there's North America and Asia, an even split, 47% and 47%, then a little bit in Middle East and Africa, as well as others. All right, well, that should shape the focus of our conversation then. Thanks everyone for answering. So let's see, third-party risk management. From a financial services perspective, there's of course so many things that you have to take into account. But one thing that we want to focus on, or I want to focus on here, is in the aspect of third-party risk management, specifically geopolitical risk, since we're talking about different jurisdictions here. We're currently in a globalized business, globalized world, and there's a lot of cross-border engagements and transactions that are going on. And from a financial services perspective, it's really important for us to be able to screen and monitor all the transactions we're processing. And so it's important for us to screen these transactions and make sure there's no red flags associated with it, and to compare that against, say, for example, sanctions lists. And lists and other lists in the that's important for the jurisdictions we are operating in or whose currency we process. So say, for example, US dollars, even though in the case of sanctions for some European companies, US dollars or they don't have operations in the US, but because they process US dollars, it's important for us to follow US sanctions. So in that case, we need to screen against sanctions lists as well as several other lists. And then aside from screening transactions, we also need to screen our customers during onboarding as well as periodically thereafter. So it's important for us to know if there's any sanctions risk associated with them, whether there's any adverse media associated with them in the jurisdictions they're located in. What else? Whether they're politically exposed persons. So those are the major check boxes that we need to look into. And then aside from that, of course, the big part of it is also trade finance. We need to understand what sort of transactions we're signing up for, whether these letters of credit or these bills of lading and whatnot have any red flags in them that we need to take into account. So say, for example, 5 years ago or so, you'd have to manually enter the names, every name you see in the bill of lading or in the invoices, and every address you see in there, you have to manually key into the system to screen them. But nowadays, there's systems where you just scan the documents itself, and the system will generate alerts if there's any red flags associated with them. And then you'd have people look into them, analysts, to see if you need to do more due diligence, whether you need to ask for more information, dig a little deeper, or to make a decision that this transaction is not within your risk appetite, so you can't process it. So those are the major things that you need to take into account. And then, of course, additionally, all of these risks, all of these issues are associated with, operational, legal, and reputational risk. Because if we process something that's related to money laundering, or is related to fraud, or sanctions, or human trafficking, that would affect the reputation of the bank. And of course, would expose us to legal liability as well, as we may be fined millions or even billions of dollars in all the different jurisdictions we're in. So those are all, of course, important for us. And we have to cater our operations to make sure we can handle all of the due diligence that's necessary to process those transactions. So that's kind of it in a nutshell from a financial services perspective. What about you, Ajinkya and Patrick?
Good, I could go next. So the way I've seen kind of compliance evolve and also blend from one industry to the other is perhaps a bit relevant these days, because you're finding that not only, yes, we've got disruptive tech and we've got blockchain and AI, but what we're also seeing is we're seeing companies are active in more than one space at a time. So you're finding regulated industries now being holding some level of financial services authorization if they're offering an insurance product or a service along those lines. And so we see that having a regulatory or a compliance approach that also brings from different industries the perspectives is perhaps a good idea. So I can give you an example from one of my previous companies. What we were able to do is to have a supply chain transparency, so, a supplier code of conduct. So this is kind of basically everywhere these days, and everyone wants everybody else to sign their code of conduct. And then you've got, whose code are we going to use and who's going to sign, or we don't want to sign that. Well, this one's not strong on this element, and so on and so forth. So while we were developing our own in this process, I actually imported financial services concepts into our supply code of conduct, because the fundamental idea of supply chain transparency is to know. And how do we know what somebody else is doing, something that they should be doing? How do we create that as a legal obligation, obviously contractually, not through regulatory means? So the concept that was imported was what the FCA or any other national regulators have is what they impose on their firms. The firms need to notify the regulators what the regulator reasonably expects notice of. So this creates a reverse burden on the suppliers to tell us what we would reasonably expect notice of within a supplier code of conduct context. Now, this could be child labor, this could be corruption convictions, this could be money laundering issues or sanctions list breaches, OFACs, and what have you. And and this, of course, goes within their entire chain, within their tiers. So we're not talking about just tier 1, but tier 2, 3, and 4. Similarly, what I'm also finding is a bit of an evolution from, we talk about third-party monitoring risk. The first thing that comes to everyone's mind is AML KYC. Is there anti-money laundering? Is there know your customer? Is that done properly? And the purpose is, are we dealing with tainted money? So that's kind of, is it money related to mafia transactions, related to drug sales, illegal arms sales, and what have you, being very 30, 40 years ago. It's kind of moved on from that to more tainted goods. Are these goods tainted by environmental violations, human rights violations, deforestation, if you're using paper, pulp, or natural resources in manufacturing, whatever it is you need. And that has now taken a hold. So not only are we seeing, your standard third-party checks against databases, and we've got a number of providers out there, but we're also finding certain providers outside of this industry, in the aviation industry, that usually provide weather reporting services, providing satellite imagery of our forests to tell you if your suppliers in that region are engaged in excessive deforestation. And this kind of cuts the chase and goes straight to the source of whatever it is you're buying. So thinking very, very plainly here, but cutting trees for paper, the paper you want to buy to, package your products or what have you, is it coming from excessive deforestation? Well, here's a photograph from 10 years ago, here's a photograph from 9 years ago, and this is how your suppliers have behaved in that space. That kind of gives a visibility we haven't seen in the past. And that's 3 to 7 years ago. What I'm seeing happening next is, in a sense, tainted investments. Do we have investors active in this space where a particular supplier may not be breaking the law, but may not be exactly ethical in his practices? And it could be something along the lines of indigenous rights. Maybe they're not honoring indigenous rights, they're not honoring fair wages, and fair wages not by local standards, but by international standards. So there's all of these multiple facets that have evolved and then come to bear. I'm probably going to be honest and say, I don't think it's realistic or possible to meet all standards at the best capabilities all the time. I just don't think that's realistic. And at some points in time, either tough choices need to be made or tough procedures need to be put in place when you do identify a certain failure. And that's, I think, really where the crux of the situation lies as of today. Either you know for a fact you don't have everything sorted. What are you going to do? How many suppliers are you really going to remove from your list? This has nothing to do with my present employer, by the way, just to be clear. This is obviously all a personal opinion only. But this is these are some of the issues we're definitely grappling with as I speak to my colleagues across the industry.
Thank you, Ajinkya and Hera. And we're going to ask Patrick the tough questions now.
Great.
As we know, over the last 20 months, there can be certain unexpected pressures on your supply chain caused either by completely unpredictable and different consumer behavior driven by an event like a pandemic, or just a need to completely rethink your supply chain on the fly because suddenly goods are no longer transiting from certain regions, certain suppliers, certain sources for reasons completely outside your control.
Mm-hmm.
It could be short term, like the Suez Canal being blocked by a stray boat, or it could be much longer term if a pandemic again shuts certain ports and transit of goods from certain destinations. In a complex business like yours, so how do you adjust? How do you deal with these tough situations, knowing you can't be on top of everything all the time and still run a viable business?
Yeah. So, and very, very timely question, because we've had a number of those. You pointed some out, and today we're faced with energy prices soaring, Chinese government shutting down plants and the like, and so it's a continuous battle. How do you deal with that? Well, it's ultimately all about a risk balancing act that you need to do. Ajinkya, you mentioned that you can never cover it all, and that's absolutely a fact. And so what do you do? Where do you look? Where do you take your risks? And that's what it's all about. So what we want to make sure that we do up front is that we have, well, first of all, a choice, right? And that we screen our choice of suppliers in this case, if that's the question, to make sure that you can rank them, right? And ranking them means, how good are their manufacturing process and the like, but it also means where are they based? What kind of regulatory pressure might they come under from their own government? What kind of practices are they using? Thinking about China, India, and the like. You got to be careful who you partner up with, and so make sure you've got the choice. Make sure you've done your due diligence up front, so you don't have to scramble last minute to make to shift from one supplier to another, and then know who you can do business with. I think the worst thing you can do is a gut reaction because your normal supplier shut down, and you go to the next person and it gets you in a world of pain because you haven't done your due diligence.
Thank you, Patrick. Let's take the concept of world of pain and Ajinkya, if we ask you to sort of put back your former regulatory hat, and I know you'll have a UK perspective, but it's probably reflected across most regulators in Western economies. How much trouble can a corporation get into if faced with an unusual situation, it's forced to make a choice and then have its due diligence process play catch up? Will there be leniency, or is that just, are you in trouble from the word go if you're having to pivot and you try to do your due diligence retrospectively?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I think there really is a lot to draw from financial services regulation and enforcement practices into other industries. So, two things immediately come to mind. One is having a risk-based approach, and then this is kind of the fundamental of any good compliance program within the FS space. And the second is, flipping the perspectives here. But as a regulator, we knew for a fact we cannot catch everything. We knew for a fact we cannot enforce and stop all, so to speak, breaches or conduct that would breach. So we had to implement, and so does the European Commission, for example, we have to implement a prioritization criteria that we have to prioritize certain wrongdoings over others when it comes to enforcement. And the prioritization criteria took into account a number of factors, including what is the extent of the harm to the consumers in that particular context. I strongly recommend companies to have similar programs internally. And then it could be harm to environment, it could be harm to employees, it could be harm to any of those factors. And then to develop a proper criteria. And I think that's perhaps where most corporations kind of fall short and then get into trouble. So it's less about, something happened and that's it. You're going to lose an arm and a leg, but more about you did not have a risk-based approach. You did not bother putting adequate controls, systems and controls in place that would allow for your corporation to catch these things in the first place. So it's that the focus does shift from an enforcement perspective from did it happen to did you have enough to catch it when it will happen? And I think that's the point that's often missed. I think Hera, you might be able to speak from not HSBC, but from a banking perspective.
Okay, definitely. Speaking of a world of pain, so Patrick mentioned about supply chain issues and things like that, and I think not doing due diligence on the industries and would actually bring about a world of pain for both banks as well as the industry or for customers, because when we see red flags in there, then we have to start asking questions, asking for more information and asking for more information about the information you just provided, which leads to a lot of delay of those transactions, which could end up, resulting in fines or demurrage or some other, non-performance of contract. So it's a world of pain indeed, and something that we all need to take into account. So just take, for example, the vessel you're using to transport certain goods. A lot of banks have vessel tracking systems in place to see where those vessels have been. Did they make an unscheduled pit stop in North Korea? Or did they do another stop in a jurisdiction that's really close to Iran? That's unscheduled, and you start asking why and what were you transporting? Did you know that it made a stop there, and what due diligence did you do? So that raises even more questions, and we have to ask those questions, because if we have access to information and we just ignore it, then we might be fined by our regulators. So it's we just need to do what we need to do. And speaking of supply chain risk, brings to mind one of the issues that cropped up before, where the U.S. Treasury, specifically OFAC, suddenly sanctioned one of the largest aluminum suppliers in the world. And so no financial institution that wants to process US dollars could process any transaction that involves aluminum from one of the largest aluminum suppliers in the world. You can probably see how that could result in a lot of issues, not just for banks, but also for people making everyday items, not just, aluminum foils or God knows, aluminum is used in everything nowadays. So, you definitely have to take sanctions risk into account, as well as, money laundering, human trafficking, etc., because those are some of the things that regulators would look at us, and also eventually look at you as well.
All three of you mentioned the shift from maybe the more traditional financial crime focused due diligence, which was the norm 10, 15 years ago. Certainly when I started, that's the main thing that people were concerned about, to a much more, I would say, a much healthier and much more holistic view of due diligence, to try to capture a much wider range of reputational issues and things that in some cases are not yet of regulatory concern, but definitely are of concern to your investors, to your customers, and to your staff. And Patrick and Ajinkya have mentioned a few of these concerns, whether it's modern slavery or broader labor issues, environmental concerns. In prior sessions, we ESG came up a lot. I mean, that means that sitting in your roles, you have a lot more to look at and to assess as part of your risk assessment and your risk-based approach. So let's talk about the ways in which you can get your compliance processes to cope. One of those, of course, is technology. Patrick, do you want to sort of mention some of the things that you've seen that have helped either in your current or former roles or in your industry or wider, improve and make in-house teams more efficient when it comes to just identifying risk, flagging it up, and allowing decision makers to make the right risk-based decision?
Yeah. So if I park technology to the side for a bit, not that it's not important, it's hyper important, but for me, it's know your business, right? It's know where the risks are, know where it could go wrong, and focus on that, because you can't cover it all. There's no way you can catch everything. And so if I just look at the industry that I'm active in, certain of our products can have a dual use, right? They have a civil use and they have a military use. Well, that's where you focus. Certain of our products will go to country or shouldn't go to, well, we're a US company, so we're a little bit more tricky anyway. So we've got a ban on countries, we focus on that. And we're gonna look at end use as well. Where will that product end up in? Now, for some products, probably doesn't matter as much. For other products, it will matter as much. And so, honestly, the only way that we can cope with it is by having, of course, the processes, the SAP screening that you have, and by focusing on those areas in your business where you know it could go wrong, and where, if it does go wrong, the CIA or others come knocking at your door, the FBI come knocking at your door, which you really don't want. You want to avoid that reputational damage, because I can't think of anything worse than having your company suffer from a reputation. Your company's splattered all over the newspaper for delivering into, Iran, North Korea, whatever it is. That's hard to recover from. And so that's where we focus. And then we may talk about that later, is the other focus is, and that's a little bit more geopolitical, I guess, is how do you marry several regulatory or sanction up with each other? You've got countries that are just putting sanctions on each other, and you're in the middle, and you need to try to still do business. How do you marry that? And it's what we do, right? It's clever wording in your contracts, and trying to figure out a way around it. And it's every day it changes, and so you need to keep up with what's going on. So it's knowledge of regulations, knowledge of sanctions, and knowledge of your business, and focusing on that.
I'd like to pick up on a point that Patrick's made, because it's something I've seen a lot of organizations trip up over. Because this audience is primarily consists of European companies, with some US companies with a presence in Europe. It's very easy to forget that Ukraine has its own sanctions set up against a much wider range of Russian entities than the European Union or the US. It's very easy to forget that Saudi Arabia has launched a wide-ranging list of sanctions against, well, Iranian, but also Levantine companies, Jordanian companies. And these can be an issue if you have operations and people in those countries. And they can be a blind spot if you are only focused on US and European regulatory requirements. Because the minute you have somebody traveling in country and you've put yourself in breach, the last thing you want is some colleague spending time in a sort of Saudi holding cell, because you happen to have on the books a Lebanese supplier, which is absolutely fine as far as every other regulator is concerned, but is on the blacklist as far as the Saudis are concerned. Ajinkya, again, in terms of trying to do more with less, where do you see technology playing a part? And Anila, could you launch our second polling question? We'll have that running in the background while Ajinkya gives us his views, and then we'll move to Hera.
Sure. Actually, just in the Saudi point, full disclosure, I was recently in close contact with a Saudi government agency, but I wouldn't go into further detail. That was just so you are all aware. And for personal reasons. In any event, you're right. So I think technology does this. I personally think technology has always been game-changing on both sides of the law. When banking evolved from filling out paper and to more internet-based banking, so did the crime, so did the regulation, and so did the enforcement. So you do find always this cycle of tech, so to speak. It'll either start on the regulation side or on the criminal side, but it's always going to happen. An example I gave earlier in one of the roundtables was a few years ago within the FCA, we had a quants team that had developed algorithms to scan all the transactions, all the financial transactions reported to the UK FCA to identify certain SARs should have been reported but were not. And that was one way to identify if certain compliance officers were not doing their jobs, and to then give a call and say, well, we think this is an SAR, why was this not reported? Let us know. That was an example where perhaps algorithms were used on the regulator side slightly earlier than what we found more on the regulated side. Algorithmic trading, of course, had already kicked off. However, other technologies that are coming into play now, or blockchain in particular, I'm not talking about Bitcoin, I'm not talking about crypto assets, which in itself is a compliance nightmare, but just blockchain as a technology that allows for multi-parties to have the same information at the same time and validate it, allowing for a transaction to get executed. This potentially changes regulation entirely, or I should say enforcement practices entirely, because in a blockchain environment, you no longer even need to send a request for information. RFIs are obsolete because the regulator can itself have a node on the chain and get all that data as it's taking place. And again, public, the FCA has created a regulatory node on a test basis. So why send an RFI? Why do a dawn raid? It's not needed. I have all the data, I have all the evidence, and this is it. It's disclosed. The two major changes that I do predict it will bring about, number one is a dwindling down in dawn raids. And secondly, and this has been the regulator's problem the whole time, is information asymmetry. So when compliance breaches occur, the regulator only knows bits and pieces, because the bulk of what has happened is on the other side, it's within the corporate hands. Having blockchain-based transactions, it flips the game. The regulator knows as much as the company, maybe even more, because it has multiple blockchain accesses and not just one private chain. So this has significant impacts, maybe not now, maybe not 2025, but by 2030, 2035, I'm pretty confident we're going to see a stark change in how enforcement takes place. And that's definitely a big one. I think artificial intelligence kind of goes back to the algorithms, and as they improve, you will find regulators adopting them as well. We have a case in the UK already where pricing of two, I think, poster companies was aligned using algorithms. So they both developed algorithms that they will check each other's prices and then set their own prices automatically. And that is, in a way, telling the guy to do this every day, which is no different than cartel conduct, where the two agree to set prices by looking at what the other person's doing. So that was more of a traditional way of approaching it, but I'm sure we're going to see more innovative ways of doing this. I'm going to add a quick note before handing over to Hera on this one. It was in Italy, if I'm not mistaken, but there was a research institute that developed algorithms, two of them, and placed them in a closed environment to see how they interact with each other. And since both algorithms were coded to maximize their retail pricing, they eventually entered into an inter-algorithmic collusion where they decided to not undercut each other, because mapping the graphs, they figured this is the best price point for both of us, and let's just price it. So they basically ended up in a collusive environment without any human interaction whatsoever. So that's an interesting case study. It's in the closed environment, like I said, not the real world, but still interesting in how things can end up a particular way.
So Jinkia is predicting a dystopian future where not only will most of our roles be obsolete and replaced by machine, but the criminal behavior we're trying to detect and prevent will also be fully automated and launched by machines. With that happy thought,
the liability point, though. Yes.
Or with that happy point, Hera, give us your view on where you see the game changers in technology to assist with sort of third-party risk management. And Anila, if we could have the answer to the poll, because we'll see if Hera's views match the audience's.
Yeah, I would say so. Yep, I expected screening and monitoring systems to be used fairly a lot throughout the different industries, and case management system to pick up the alerts that are generated where those screening and monitoring systems are, of course, important. I can see that there's a limited appetite for blockchain technology and machine learning and artificial intelligence. I agree with this, since from what I can see out in the industry, there's a lot of hesitancy around using machine learning and artificial intelligence to look at these transactions and make the decisions. The machines are the ones making the decisions versus people. There's a lot of regulatory blindness in terms of technology to this respect. Maybe Ajinkya would disagree with me there, but I find that some of them don't really understand it, and so they ask a lot of questions, and us being lawyers or financial or bankers don't really understand the technology itself, and so it's hard for us to explain something that's too technical, and so there's a lot of hesitancy there. With regard to blockchain technology, I think it would be amazing if what Ajinkya said could be used throughout the industry. I think that would definitely change how we do KYC, or know your customer, how we do transaction monitoring, because it's all just going to be there, attached to the cryptocurrency or whatever it is. So maybe in 20 years time, we'll see how it goes. But as of right now, I agree that, screening and monitoring system and case management systems are the bread and butter of compliance folks.
I mean, I get brought in my role by organizations that in some cases surprise me by having so little in place, or at least the processes are good, but in terms of technology, digitization, or even a vaguely auditable filing system are still very sadly lacking. Patrick, with your view, and again, not specific to Huntsman, but generally in your view of previous roles in the industry that you work in, where do you see the bigger failures and gaps that people should look to plug? The things that really can go wrong just because either there isn't the resource, the technology, or just the attention?
I would say it's probably on the customer side, because, well, first of all, there's a reluctance to do too much due diligence on customers, because after all, you want to do the sale, you want to get the money in, and so everything you do there is tougher than on the supplier side. And these days, you can get it really wrong by not knowing who's behind your customers, who's actually in control of your customer. Is it a company that's actually controlled by a Russian entity that's on one of the lists, etc.? And it's really hard to do that, and there's a lot of internal resistance, I would say, to get that done properly. And then there's not the resources to do it anyway. And so, back to my previous point, is that where you prioritize? Is that not where you prioritize? My guess is we'll over time we'll move there. It's a process, and we just need to get there and get over the resistance internally to do it properly.
Thank you, Patrick. And I'm afraid we're fast running out of time. I mean, this is such a vast topic. We were only going to scratch, but hopefully we've planted some ideas and some follow-up questions in the mind of the audience. Hera, do you want to have one overarching closing comment, please? And then we will cede the floor to the lawyers at Net Zero who are going to be waiting patiently to come on next.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess in a nutshell, third-party risk management is a very broad topic. And one of the things that we said we should look into is geopolitical risk as well as emerging technologies. So those are the two that you need to pay close attention to, in our opinions.
Fantastic. Patrick, Ajinkya, Hera, thank you so much for this thought-provoking discussion. And Neela, over to you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that session. We are just promoting the next speakers to join, so they will join shortly.
And I think we are almost ready to go. I'm delighted to introduce Adam Woodhull. I'm Executive Director of Lawyers for Net Zero, who will be moderating the next panel. And Adam, in the interest of time, I will hand over to you to introduce Kieran Kelsey and Edward Bridges. Thank you very much for yet another session.
No, looking forward to it. Thank you so much. And it sounds like it was a very interactive session we've just had there. So I'm really looking forward to this session because, you know, obviously why we're here is because, you know, we are in a climate crisis, and this is something that businesses around the world are taking action on. And importantly, and the reason why we're here very specifically is because General Counsel and their legal teams can be very much supportive of that action that's happening to achieve net zero. And in fact, people might have heard, there's the race to net zero, which is a UN run things, which is the great thing with this race is a race that everybody wins when everybody wins. So I'm delighted that Kieran Kelsey and Edward Bridge from Eon UK and Zurich Insurance UK, respectively, are going to be joining us today. And I'm actually not going to do anything more in terms of introductions to them, because they'll be doing that. They're far better at introducing themselves than I could ever be. But what we're going to go through today, there is going to be some audience interaction. We've got a little polling thing that's going to be coming up, a word cloud, and one of the things as well, we've got a bonus because this is the last session of the day. We're actually, because this is net zero is such a big subject, Kieran and Ed have both agreed very kindly to stay for an extra 10 minutes so we can have a full Q&A session at the end, as well as their work. So and they're going to be doing their kind of shares, and that's that Q&A will come at the end. So I think the first thing I'll do, just to kind of hopefully grab everybody's attention, is I'll launch a poll. So what we've got here is, I'll put it in the chat, so you can just, if you look in the chat, you will find there's a poll which is just about to be shared in there. Just a second. Which going to everyone. Okay, so you should be able to see in the chat, so there's a poll that's come up. Now, if you can't see that in the chat, fortunately, I'm going to be able to share this with you. So if it doesn't, you've got a corporate firewall that's deflecting you, you can deal with it that way. So this is a word cloud. So what I'm asking you to do is filling what is stimulating the response to net zero in your organization. So if you type in written responses to this, so it's not a poll, it's a word cloud. So we're asking you, what are the things that are stimulating the response to this? And there we go, we've got our first response there, investors. You should be able to see this here. If you can't access it through the link that I put in the chat, then there is also, you can access it through your own separate device by going to slido.com and tapping in that number there. So we've got some more stuff coming up. Image, reputation, investors. What else is coming up? Looks like investors is quite popular as an idea here. And okay, so what we'll do is we'll maybe come back to that. So it looks as though that investors are the big one, obviously. Oh, we've got customers, earth, employees, the right thing. So there's quite a number of things that are stimulating the response here. And I think that will also probably stimulate our conversation today. So I will now stop the sharing and go to, but you can keep on adding to that poll, that word cloud, but we will start off with now introductions, and we'll start off with Ed. So if you could give us what your role is, Ed, and why you're tackling climate action.
Thanks, Adam. And hello, everyone. So my name's Ed Bridge. I'm the General Counsel for Zurich UK. We are a major insurer. We cover everything from life to general insurance. We're the largest commercial insurer in the UK. And insurers have a particular place in all of this, in that we can be quite influential as investors. We provide insurance that facilitates a lot of economic activity, which is pretty key. And we're also significantly impacted by climate change. So there's an element of being also the canary in the coal mine, where you really see it when climate change hits, particularly in areas where you're providing the cover. So we have a series of kind of motivations as an industry. On a personal level, why am I involved in this? So there's an element of it being the right thing to do, and I think a lot of people feel that way, probably on a varying scale. And some of it's your personal view of this thing and which way things are going, what needs to be done. I think there's also an important piece in all of this about what is the future. And if you want to be relevant and you want to do your job well, it's very hard to do that if you cannot have something meaningful to say and contribute around sustainability generally, and then specifically climate change, because it's going to be the key, seminal issue in the next 20 or 30 years. And if you can't hold your place around the table or be relevant and understand what's driving change, then you're just not going to do your job very well. So it's a mix of things, Adam, from a range of doing the right thing through to just doing your job properly. It involves being on top of this.
Right. Okay. And thank you for that, Ed. And Kieran.
Thanks, Adam. I'm the General Counsel, Compliance Officer and Data Protection Officer for Eon UK. And climate change for me has always been a personal interest for ever since I can remember. But from a sort of work perspective, it's obviously one of our main purposes of Eon is to support customers, whether they're business or private customers or public authorities, in the energy transition and moving to a more energy efficient and energy and climate friendly world going forward. But until probably about a year ago, for me, it was very much the work that was done by others. So we had sustainability teams, we have our public policy teams, strategy teams, everybody else looking at this topic. And I hadn't really, until about a year ago, sort of really cottoned on to the fact that actually there is a lot that we as the legal team, in-house legal team, can do around this. Partly triggered by some of the discussions I've been having with some of my cohorts, but also by internally the organization talking about ESG targets. And that then immediately got me thinking, well, that fits really neatly into the compliance space. And therefore, there is a real big element of my team needing to, first of all, understand, but also for us all to be involved in that conversation. And the journey to net zero is one of our key purposes going forward. So it fits in well with what we do from an Eon UK perspective.
Fabulous. Okay, so and then following on from that, it sounds like you've had an opportunity to kind of take quite a lot of action on this. What sort of action have you been taking to help champion net zero and deliver some of this?
I think initially when I started looking at this, there's so much information out there and it's really quite overwhelming. So I started off with setting up a sort of mini committee or mini team within my team of people who were particularly interested in the whole net zero agenda and how we as the in-house legal team and compliance team could support on those areas. And I've got one member of my team leading on that. And so I'm in really close contact with her as well, but really she's sort of pulling together what we as a legal team are doing internally. And that sort of culminated by sort of around June time with us doing a team event for the entire team with the main purpose of upskilling everyone and really for people to understand the terminology, because there's loads of terminology around, some which is generally bandied about, like the word sustainability, but actually there was quite an underlying meaning below it, but also some of the more detailed terminology that's being used both externally but also internally when you start talking about how do you measure what you are contributing as an organization either towards climate change or towards net zero. And as part of that team day, we also discussed within the team what we could be doing to support both ourselves, but also our colleagues on the net zero journey. So, for example, we had one session which included colleagues from our supply chain. So we were talking to them about what their aims were and how we could support them and how we could support each other. And we also did a small piece that was a bit, well, just brought it home to everyone, where everyone was required to put out their personal pledge. We did give people advance notice so they could think about it, but the personal pledges were all around things like, you know, I'm going to walk more. I'm going to, for example, walk my kids to school rather than taking the car. So it was little things, but things that made it become real for people around what they could do. Other people said, I'm going to print, or we haven't printed things over lockdown anyway, so I'm going to stay like that and just not print when we go back into the office. We then developed out of that a sort of 5-action plan that we are now progressing. So we've got things like the supply chain piece that I talked about, Chancery Lane contract clauses that we're looking at. Well, what would work for us? And so that's come out of that particular day that we did. And I think last but not least, discussed the topic with our sole supplier firm as well. And they contributed to our team day on some of the trends they're seeing with other clients, with other corporates, and what is currently going on in the market. And for us, the Lawyers for Net Zero Network's been really helpful in sort of triggering a couple of ideas that we wouldn't have thought of ourselves, but also keeping us on track on some things, because with the individual working groups, that's really helpful.
Right, wonderful. Well, all of that, Ed.
Thanks, Evan. So I've really struggled with this in terms of a couple of things: the pace of change, and I suppose some of the ambiguities about what's expected, what's practice, what you need to do, what's enough, what isn't. And what really struck me recently was looking back at a start of the year event I did for my team. So I oversee legal and affairs, actually, which includes quite a big chunk of the sustainability function for our business. We did a year start event on sustainability with a big focus on climate change. So I went back and looked at that. It's remarkable, actually, despite lockdown and everything that's happened since, just how far this has moved on. I mean, in terms of the key stuff I've looked at, what we tried to do, I think one of the key things was just governance. So, the management oversight, the development of metrics, who's responsible. I mean, just basic stuff like that makes quite a big difference. What doesn't seem to, I think what's caused some delay in some organizations is there's sometimes a vacuum around who is ultimately accountable. And I recognize this when you look back, particularly 4 or 5 years ago, people started talking about this, but it was hard to identify specific individuals who were responsible and, get that bonding of, the data and, what's the objective who's going to get that done? So it sounds like a small thing and it sounds a bit bureaucratic, but it's actually pretty important. And there are regulators that are requiring this as well. So you're getting a regulatory overlay to this. If you're, for example, if you're a financial services firm, Bank of England says, and PRA says, you have to have a manager who is accountable for this. But it's still not at a very detailed level and leaves you a lot of discretion about how you implement that. I think another part of it is about training and upskilling the function. The lawyers, people in public affairs, they need to develop skills to deal with this. If this is going to be a pretty key issue, as we've discussed. So thinking through, well, what those are, what is it people need to understand? What are the key, if you like, areas of expertise? I mean, they're not expected to become experts on specific scientific issues, but they do need to understand certain areas of best practice, regulation, why we need to do certain things. As we were just discussing, what Eon's done with suppliers, we've gone through a similar process where we're starting to really tighten up on our indirect emissions as well as direct. Because actually for us, I guess we're in a bit of a different position to a power company, in that actually for us, the most significant thing we can do is probably to shape markets and what's happening with our customers. We don't inherently have an enormous carbon footprint. We should still work on that. And I've become persuaded that things like, taking smaller initiatives just within individual teams are worth doing as a hygiene factor, because it contributes to the culture. But I think what I've tried to get across is, not using paper or plastic cups is not in and of it. That's not the be all and end all. We've got to aim a lot higher than that. But it's at times been a bit difficult to work out what that is. I've built a sustainability team within our business, country level, and that's still ongoing. I expect that's just going to get bigger. The question is how big is the sustainability team? Is it there to facilitate, and do you still make everybody accountable, or do you try and centralize things? My sense is you don't try and centralize. I think there's problems with that. And it has to be everyone's responsibility, albeit there have to be some accountable people who are ultimately on the hook for delivering targets. And targets work. We've seen this in other areas. And then finally, I think there's an element around sharing best practice. Now, some of that for me has been within the group. One of the big global insurers, and there's a lot of practice all around the world around what we're doing, and there's certain key messages and strategies coming out of our group. Probably haven't had as much engagement with external peers as I would like. I think we probably do need more. We're all on the same journey, and I think that because of the ambiguity around standards, methodologies, some aspects of governance, I think that's really helpful, because I think there's a lot that you miss. And you could also, if you're not careful, just see things within your own, organisation, sector. And actually, there's a lot of lessons that you can learn from talking to people in different sectors, facing slightly different challenges, but it all comes down to the same thing.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And just picking up on that last point, that's why in Lawyers for Net Zero, we set up our action learning groups to enable that sort of sharing across the sectors. So yeah, we'll stick with you actually. Just following this up, looking more at the bigger picture now, is why do you personally think it's kind of important to guard against greenwashing, a term that's kind of currently growing in attention, and also why do you think in-house lawyers have a role to define what is the kind of positive side of it, what is legitimate net zero?
So I don't think we've yet seen the full consequences around greenwashing. I mean, I think we've seen some snapshots. I think famously recently, Mark Carney had a difficult time over some of his post Bank of England roles, and where it was questioned what was being done in terms of achieving set off, carbon neutrality, whatever you want to call it. And I think that that shows you the degree, the speed at which this is developing. But I think clearly society is changing. What our customers want is changing. What employees want is changing. This is moving fast. think expectations of what we need to achieve have moved, and the reputational risk actually of getting this wrong is quite significant, and it could be quite damaging. I still don't think we've seen, I'm finding it hard to see any specific examples which are as big as I think we will see in the coming years. I think it will become a growing issue. And I think it will become actually more significant once you get more standardization of metrics. I think the reason it hasn't blown up as much as it might have done is because of that lack of standardization, which means it's actually quite hard sometimes to work out who's doing what. You know, you've got the pledge wars, who's doing what they've said they would do, who isn't, what, you know, is there anybody maybe not adhering to the kinds of conduct that you would expect, or, you know, some organizations, you know, they're making pledges, it's quite hard to put it into action. So I think we will see more on this. I think lawyers have always had a key role in, you know, protecting the organization, protecting the reputation of the organization. We've always had been a, you know, sounding board. We put in place things like, you know, forms of governance. We're often asked our opinion on things, check and balance. And in this case, so I think it's multifaceted. I think you've got to see it as, you know, if you, an organisation that has the right governance framework, that understands the regulation, that's getting the right advice, that has the right contractual framework with, you know, its suppliers, its counterparties, you're much less likely to fall foul of greenwashing and make all kinds of mistakes. I think that you're more likely to get them in an organisation that doesn't do those things, that, you know, doesn't have clear accountabilities, targets and standards. And I think that's where we probably can make the biggest contribution.
Yeah, great stuff. Okay, so, and Karen, what would you add to that?
You would think I'd know where the mute button is by now, wouldn't you? I think I can only echo what Ed's been explaining. I think there's a big piece, obviously, around corporate reputation. You do not want to be saying stuff in public that then turns out to be untrue, in particular in the whole climate space, which is an extremely sensitive topic at the moment. As you know, advertising standards has just issued some new guidance in that area. So this is a topic that is very much on everyone's radar. And I think as part of the legal team, we have got a role to play. We sign off any of the advertising or messaging that is going out. But there is, because of the increasing drive that obviously a lot of messaging now also goes out on social media, it's actually quite hard to then keep track of everything that is out there. So it's even more important than ever that we don't just stay in that reactive role, but we actually proactively engage with our colleagues so that they have got a feel for what can be said in public, for want of a better word, and what shouldn't be said in public because, for example, we can't substantiate it. Briefing our board members as well, but also certain teams like marketing and our social media colleagues, but it almost applies to virtually everyone, that people have got an understanding of what it is we are saying as part of our purpose and how that fits in with where we currently are on our net zero journey.
Great, yes, wonderful. So I think what we'll actually do now is we'll go into kind of like the practical tips, but I just want to trail the second piece of interaction we're going to ask for people to do, which is another word cloud. Because what we're really interested in is like how people can start to take actions, and those might be small, they might be big, there might be lots of them, there might be very few of them. So the question that you're going to be asked soon in the word cloud is, what could your role be in the race to net zero for your organization? And that might be a very small one to begin with. So don't be embarrassed by just putting in something that feels at the moment fairly small, but because it's actually about how you take those small actions and then build the momentum up, which is what we're all about at Lawyers for Net Zero. But what might give you a bit of inspiration in that question, I'll put it in the chat, what I'm going to be asking you very soon, what would be your role in the race to net zero for your organisation, is to go back to Kieran actually, and ask for a couple of tips maybe from you about how practically you feel people could be helping take this forward.
I think probably my top 3 tips would be, the first one is, don't get overwhelmed. There is so much stuff out there that it is really easy to just go, oh, I will read this when I have more time, which will never happen. I will read this, I will get more involved in this when I can understand absolutely everything and I really have got to the bottom of it. If you wait until then, we've missed the boat, because the next decade is absolutely crucial to achieve net zero. And so don't get overwhelmed when there is a whole load of information out there. Second tip, which links to that actually, is find your focus area within everything that is out there. Ideally a focus area that you can both relate to from your personal perspective, but also from your work perspective. So something ideally that fits in with your corporate objectives, your corporate purpose, or get others within your organization to sign up to. And then don't try and do it all yourself. So this is part of the don't just try and do everything yourself. General counsels or senior lawyers are busy people. You won't be able to do all of this yourself. Pull in other people, other colleagues, your colleagues in the environmental team, sustainability team, whatever the teams are that may have an interest in this topic. Pull them in. It needs to be a joint effort. And which brings me to my final point, discuss it with your own team as well. Don't just look outside of yourself, outside of your team to the outside world, but discuss it with your own team. And if you haven't got a team, find like-minded counterparts, whether through Lawyers on Net Zero or just reach out to your cohorts.
Great. Okay, some good tips there. And Ed?
I think I'm probably going to echo a lot of that. You know, I agree. It's a really fast developing area. I definitely don't feel like an expert. I sometimes have to, you know, Wikipedia things and remind myself of certain things, just because it's just hard to keep on top of it. The upside of that is I find that actually most people aren't an expert either, so it's quite hard to get overly embarrassed, particularly in a workplace context. You know, and you don't need to be, you know, embarrassed about that. You just need to work out what are the key things, work out what your key risks are, and work out where you want to focus your attention, and that will help you in terms of identifying who you need to work with as well. Because I think collaboration is pretty key. I think you're right to raise that, because with a lot of things that's always the answer, but with this in particular, there are so many levers you need to pull on this. I mean, we're only part of the solution, but if you just do it on your own, you'll get stuck pretty quickly and you won't achieve as much as you could. The other one is just this reiterating a point I made earlier: get your governance right. You know, if that's all you do initially, just get that sorted out, because it'll make a big impact. And that's, again, as a way of actually working with others. You'll also give yourself a role in that. You know, usually when lawyers get involved in, you know, setting up governance, there's usually some kind of role for the lawyers as well in implementing it or monitoring it, or, you know, being asked what they think about various stages. So that's pretty important. And then finally, I think there's a slight tension here. I was going to say the best is the enemy of the good, and I think that's right. I say that in the context, though, where there is a lack of standardization here, and you need to be careful. So I think you've got to, you know, focus on a few areas, do what you can, and try and identify areas where you see things like standardization coming, because that is in itself is going to be quite important in working out where you need to focus your attention. So a good example is if you work for a listed company in the UK or in another market, chances are listing rules are going to change significantly in the next couple of years. Think through what that might mean in terms of your organization, the governance, how you measure stuff, who does things, what your role is to advise on all of that. I mean, that's a good example of an area where, you know, lawyers tend to be involved in things like listing requirements.
Definitely. Great. Okay. Thanks for that, Ed. And what we'll be doing now actually is we're going to go to the poll on that question that I posed. Then I'll give you a little bit about Lawyers for Net Zero, and then we'll finish off with probably about last 5 minutes is just answering any questions. So we've got one good question in the Q&A section, but very welcome to add some more questions to the Q&A. So I've just put in the chat that poll word cloud again. So if you click on that, and I will also screen share it so you can see that. But if you click on the thing in that, and you can just, these could be very small actions that you can be taking in your organization to help make it happen. So it could be some of the things that Ed and Kieran talked about, or it could be some other things. So if you can be thinking about what you're doing with that. And what I'll do actually is just whilst you're thinking about that, I'll actually go to what Lawyers for Net Zero is. So yeah, keep on popping things into that poll. So Lawyers for Net Zero, well, who are we? Well, one of the things that's very important, and you'll have noticed that Ed and Kieran are both general counsel. And yes, because Lawyers for Net Zero is exclusively focused on in-house counsel. And that's because we saw that if there's one part of the legal sector which could really have an impact on large organizations, it's the general counsel and their teams. So we recognise that nobody was directly talking to those people. So we thought it would be a really great thing to get a group of general counsel and also the in-house counsel together. And what we do is we've convened that community. We've given some guidance through our net zero action principles. And then also, most importantly, we have our action learning groups, which are like a peer-to-peer learning process where people get to understand how it's can be happening for other people like themselves, so other in-house counsel. So it's run under Chatham House rules. You can be secure that you can share. And with the feedback that we've had from the action learning groups that we've done have been great. And we're now approaching 100 people that have been in some shape or form working with us to champion net zero. So obviously you can get in touch with me about that. And I'll just put my my contact details in the chat so that you can understand more about it by connecting with me. You can do that through LinkedIn, or you can do it through by email. So here's in the chat function, my LinkedIn and my email. You can very welcome to get in touch with me, and also obviously you can get in touch through our website, lawyersfornetzero.com. So now let's see what we've got from the poll before we go to the final thing, because I think there's been quite a bit going on in there. So yes, we've got quite a lot of things going on. Facilitate, build strategic relations, talk about it, walk the talk, switch the power off, just as simple as that. Yes, build awareness and take leadership. I think that's really important by being a model and encouraging others. So there's some really great points that you've been pulling out there, which I think cover what we've been discussing. So we'll finish off now on the Q&A as we've got one in there, but very welcome to add some more. And this is quite a specific question, but it's quite an interesting one. So just the question is, what kinds of impacts do you see for other industries following the ruling in the Netherlands against Shell? And for those that might not be aware of that, that's effectively Shell was taken to court by some Dutch activists who basically have said that they weren't taking this seriously enough, and Shell lost the case. Now Shell has to decarbonize much faster than they were proposing, and that's not just for what they're doing in the Netherlands, that's for their global operations. So yeah, Ed or Kieran, who would like to go first on answering that question? Maybe Ed?
Happy to have a go.
Maybe.
So I think I think the Shell case is quite unusual. I mean, it's partly a reflection of Dutch law, and it's partly a reflection of what Shell does and the ability to bring such cases in the Netherlands. I don't think that means it doesn't have any read across, though. I think there is, I would say, there is even a read across in the UK where this is a bit less developed, but I think there is some potential, particularly for more localized events already, for claims around, for example, emissions, pollution, damage to people's health, physical damage, where you can show, for example, that somebody's emitting significantly. I think there's also a potential for potential exposure around indirect emissions, for financial services companies, for some kinds of companies. I think that's a bit harder to see coming through as a primary liability at the moment, but with one caveat, I think you've got to accept that if the premise is, if what we said earlier about reputational risk being key is right, and then the danger of things like greenwashing or not adhering to targets, and if it's right that if you think that the value of corporations is increasingly less in physical assets, more in goodwill, know-how, technology, etc., you could see some significant investor claims in these areas. So I wouldn't see a direct read across globally, but I do see some read across and some exposures that people need to be mindful of, which then takes you through things like directors and officers. Do individuals understand what their accountabilities are and what potential exposures of the company?
Yeah, totally. And Karen, what would you add?
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with Ed that it is an unusual case, the Shell case, and probably quite an extreme case. But I think it probably highlights for every organization that net zero is not something to ignore. And I know from an Eon perspective, as an energy company, we very much look at it as our customers are demanding this, and our customers want to hear from us about how we are progressing on that net zero journey. So for us, it is absolutely crucial that that is something we have to focus on, because that is where, first of all, we can play a really big part in, for example, by offering ground source heat pumps instead of gas-fired boilers, etc., etc. But it's also something where that we feel the customers are going to be not demanding that going forward. And if we are not offering energy efficient and low carbon solutions, we will stay behind. So it's not so much the threat of potential litigation, it's more around staying in the market and standing for something we all believe in, which is that journey to net zero.
I think I have one more thing, which is that so I actually think the biggest read across is something like Dieselgate. If you look at the exposures, and now with potentially the widest consequences, actually, if you look at the exposures of some of those car companies in the billions, I mean multiple billions, what they did is they made promises about the environmental performance of the cars that turned out not to be correct. And customers are trying to get their money back in whole or part, saying, well, I would never have bought your product. And I think that's pretty significant. It goes to the greenwashing point, but we will all be making statements about what we do and how, and that underlines why such care is going to be required, particularly if customers and consumers rely on these and put great store by them in a way that maybe they wouldn't have done 10 years ago.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because actually bringing things bang up to date, BMW and Daimler, I think it might have just been today, they're being taken to court in Germany by activist group around effectively that they could have done more to much more around their action on climate. And then also just recently, Client Earth are taking Just Eat and the cruise liner business Carnival to court for their lack of climate action. So whilst the Shell case was pretty spectacular and might be relatively unusual, when I think that it shows that as an organisation, those are fairly disparate organisations. Just Eat, Carnival aren't ones that you'd necessarily expect that would be taken to court. BMW and Daimler maybe a little bit more, but you know, you just don't know who's going to be around the corner as an activist if you're sitting there in the role as a GC. So it's something we need to be quite aware of. So, well, we're at our 1/4 now. So what I'll do is I'll just, as a final thing, obviously, as I said, it's in the chat. You can connect with me personally. And also there's my email address there. And then, of course, there's the Lawyers for Net Zero website, which you can go there and there's a connection form there. So I just want to finish off by thanking Anila and the team for all the work that they do behind the scenes, making this happen. They work very hard, and it's fantastic to have this platform to be able to share all this really interesting information. Thank you to Kevin for chairing for today, and then, but most of all, thank you very much to Kieran